Hi, everybody. This is Matthew Pose with Pose Acoustics, and I'm going to answer questions, which I know I have not been good about doing and have not been on top of, and probably many of you just stopped asking questions because of that. So I apologize, but I will try to get back on top of that. So this question comes from, I apologize if I mispronounced this, but Matthew Vice Domini. It was probably from a long time ago. It says one day ago on the sheet, but that definitely isn't right. So he did a $50 donation or payment for this, I guess. I appreciate that. Thank you. That's very generous. I have a Theory audio system that has DSP, EQ, and the power amp, both on the input and output side. I also have the ability to adjust EQ in the Denon processor using Odyssey Pro. Where would it be best to do the EQ? Does it matter? Would you do different things in different stages? So before I move on, I'm just going to start with that one. I think the answer is yes, I do different things in different stages. What I would do, so first off, when you're doing a Theory audio system, they have factory EQ they want you to use that they've already done based on anechoic. So of course, you need to make sure you're using their preset before you add any additional EQ, and that should be done in that amp. I would also say that in general, I try to get a system pretty roughed in using the EQ in the amps like that, if possible, especially for subwoofers. So I really wouldn't be applying much in the way of boost in the bass. In Odyssey, I would be doing that in the amp itself. And then for just general room correction stuff, that you can do in the Odyssey Pro software. And generally, I find that to be fine. There's not a huge difference between doing it in one or the other. The only reason why you might choose to do it in the amps versus in Odyssey Pro might be because there's certain things you'd be doing where you'd want to bypass Odyssey completely. I don't think that that's the question you're asking, but if that was the case, then yeah, do it in the amps. Some people might argue something like, well, what about, if you're using Odyssey, aren't you like being forced to use 48 kilohertz or below sampling? And then what about the amps? But actually those amps are limited in the same way. So it doesn't really matter. In fact, even if you were to be able to handle higher sampling rate, the amp isn't going to allow it. So that's just an issue with those amps. The next question you said was, secondly, I have flipped my on-wall speakers upside down, so the tweeter is on the bottom and more in line with the center channel. I think this sounds better, but you don't really hear it mentioned as good practice. What are your thoughts on this? So in the case of the Theory audio speakers, it should be fine to do that. It does. So that speaker is not like a symmetric MTM that has two woofers and it has a tweeter and then two woofers. And by flipping it, you've now got the two woofers and then a tweeter. But if you look at the response, the advantage of what you did was that the way that they seem to have shaped the lobe of that speaker, you actually have what looks to me like a cleaner lobe in the vertical measurements on axis and above than you do below. So by doing that, you're hitting your ceiling, I suppose, with an uglier response, but you're actually getting a cleaner response where you are if you're sitting below the on axis of the speaker. And typically, if it's a multi-row theater, we would be placing the speakers above your level. So I would say, yes, that's a potentially good practice. And then as you mentioned, since your center channel apparently is below the screen instead of behind the screen, which in and of itself is a compromise. When you talk about like best practices, what I like to point out is that we're talking about best compromises to make because it's not the ideal situation. The ideal situation would have been an acoustically transparent screen with three identical speakers behind the screen. In this scenario, you've done a speaker below the screen. And so by flipping the tweeters, you're getting those more in line with each other. And that's not a bad idea. And so I would say, yeah, that's probably a best practice. It's a compromise, and you would have to make a decision about whether that made sense. Now, as an example of where I wouldn't bother doing that, well, what if your center channel is a foot off the ground? In that scenario, I don't know that getting the left and the right speakers at the same height is a good idea. That's too low. So I would ideally want to get the left and right speakers at a more appropriate height and instead just accept that there's a compromise with the center. And in a scenario like that, I'd probably even look at other options like moving the center channel above. So anyway, I hope that's helpful information on how we optimize systems like that and deal with that. It's really common with a lot of speakers today to do this. Something I just mentioned about the Theory audio speakers, and this is not the only product on the market that does this. It's fairly common. QSC actually does this and refers to it as like the intrinsic, I forget what they call it now, I'm forgetting the term. It's like an intrinsic improvement, intrinsic response improvement or something like that. But anyway, There's a couple ways. So the best possible way you could do a speaker, and I mean this I don't mean this like there's no good speakers that are passive. There are lots of really, really good speakers that are passive. Take that away for a minute and just think theoretically. Theoretically, assuming perfect amplifiers of the best quality with perfect DA converters and AD converters or digital connections for that matter, with perfect accurate DSP. The best solution is always going to be an active speaker. And the reason isn't always for the reasons that you often hear. People will say things like, well, the amplifier is going to have lower distortion when it's able to just focus on like the tweeter or the mid-range or the woofer. And that's true, but it's a pretty minor improvement. Often there's other bigger issues you're dealing with. And the bigger one is that you have more degrees of freedom to work with, basically. You have more precision in the crossover. You have an ability to do very, very fine tweaking. You have an ability to do a huge number of slopes in very precise ways. And you can do unbelievable amounts of EQ. You can apply EQ in a passive crossover. There are, I call them trap filters. There are filters. They typically are resistor, inductor, capacitor filters that are in parallel rather than in series, although actually there's series notch filters as well. And you can put a lot of those in. The problem is you're talking about between two, because some can be done with two. So between 2 and 3 elements per filter. And it's a little harder to get the precision that you can get without parts matching with a digital DSP type system. So when you've got an active speaker, you've got this ability to provide really, really precise EQ and really precise crossovers and filtering. You can build in limiters. And if you're really, a lot of people don't do those well, but there are people who are really, really good at limiters. And you can build in limiters to make a speaker that's able to perform well such that it just can't overload. You can never push it past its limits. And they sound fantastic when you do that if they're done correctly. And so it's another thing that you can do with active that's great. You can often get a couple dB of extra output as well. So there's little tricks you can do in the DSP that help you get a little bit more output. So I would argue that that is the best approach. The second best approach is you take a passive speaker, but remember I said, it's hard to get enough filters basically in a speaker to make it perfect when it's passive. And so there's compromises that have to be made. And so the next best approach is you apply the DSP in the amplifier, but it's a passive speaker at its core. And this is very, very common in pro audio. And it's becoming more common in home audio products. And the advantage of this is that the speaker can be produced a bit more inexpensively, and you can end up with a better end product. It doesn't have all the advantages of an active system, but it has a lot of the advantages of an active system and a cheaper package, basically. It's a cheaper way to do the same thing. And technically, anytime you take any passive speaker and apply room correction, you're doing something like this. But one of the key differences is that room correction is trying to correct the speaker's room response and intrinsic response, whereas what I'm talking about really is more about correcting its intrinsic response separate from the room response. And that's a good idea. It can be hard to pull out sometimes what is room stuff and what is speaker stuff. And then the worst scenario would basically be a typical passive speaker with no DSP correction of any sort, not even room correction. And, that's the worst scenario because it's just the hardest to get the best response that way. So the Theory Audio product is not all that expensive for something that offers a very good response. And it's able to get that very good response because it's using these DSP amplifiers. I actually know what they use. I don't know if they'd like me sharing it, but I have the OEM versions of those sitting on my shelf over here. And I use them in multi-zone stuff. All right, so that's that. I'm going to answer some more questions in future videos, but I wanted to at least cover this topic. Please do consider continuing to ask questions. We will try to get better about answering them. I do apologize that we haven't been better about that. And we have some cool projects closing up. And so I think as those projects come to completion, to the point that we can take pictures and do videos, we're going to really do that up. And I think it's going to be a good opportunity to show you guys some of the cool theaters we do. I think we get so used to, like, I don't know what's typical, what most of us can afford to do, myself included for that matter, that we don't even realize how involved some of these bigger projects can end up being. And on my side, like I said, I can't actually afford to do what I do for my clients, so I haven't even done it in my own home much. But although I probably will change that at some point soon. Like I want to show you guys, I guess, like everything that goes into those and how neat and involved these projects are and how much thought goes into it. So anyway, that's that. We got more coming, as I said, more videos. I have a new business venture I'm working on, and we'll be launching that pretty soon. So we'll talk about that, and you'll see me doing videos around that one as well. And I think it's going to seem a little bit out of left field for what I typically do in the name of my company, but it's something that I've actually been involved with or a part of for years. And it's just an opportunity to do this more in my own way. So, all right, keep watching. I got more videos coming. Thanks, everybody.